Have you ever found yourself in that moment where someone crosses a line with you, says something that cuts deep, or treats you with complete disrespect, and instead of responding, you just freeze? You feel that surge of energy, that burning need to speak up, to defend yourself, to set things straight. But then something else kicks in, that voice in your head that whispers, just let it go, don't make a scene, be the bigger person. So you swallow it down, force a smile and walk away, telling yourself you're being mature, evolved, peaceful. But here's what nobody talks about. As you're walking away from that moment, something else is happening inside you. That energy you just suppressed doesn't disappear. It doesn't evaporate into thin air like morning mist. No, it settles somewhere, deep in your chest, in your gut, in the spaces between your thoughts. It ferments there, slowly transforming from righteous anger into something much more toxic, something that will eat away at you from the inside out. Imagine for a moment that every time you've chosen silence over truth, every time you've swallowed your words to keep the peace, every time you've let someone walk over you rather than stand your ground, you've been making a deposit into an account. But this isn't a savings account that grows your wealth. This is an account of accumulated resentment, buried rage, and diminished self-respect. And the interest rate on this account is brutal. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this psychological prison better than perhaps any philosopher who ever lived. He saw through the veneer of what society calls virtue and recognized it for what it often truly is, disguised cowardice. He watched as entire generations of people convinced themselves that their inability to confront injustice was actually a sign of their moral superiority. He witnessed the birth of what he called slave morality, a complete inversion of values where strength became weakness, courage became aggression, and the willingness to fight for yourself became selfishness. Think about the messages you absorbed growing up. Don't talk back, respect your elders even when they're wrong, turn the other cheek. If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. Be agreeable, don't rock the boat. Good girls don't argue, real men don't lose their temper. Layer by layer, year by year, these messages built a fortress around your natural instinct to defend yourself, to assert your worth, to claim your space in the world. But what if I told you that this fortress you think is protecting you is actually a prison? What if the very qualities you've been taught to see as virtues are the chains keeping you from living the life you actually want? What if your fear of conflict isn't making you a better person, but is slowly killing the person you were meant to become? Nietzsche saw this pattern everywhere he looked. He watched people surrender their power bit by bit, choice by choice, compromise by compromise, until they became hollow versions of themselves. They would rationalize their passivity as wisdom, their submission as spirituality, their fear as love. But underneath it all, he could see the resentment building like pressure in a volcano. Because when you consistently betray your own truth to avoid discomfort, you don't actually avoid you just internalize it. Every workplace has them, those people who never speak up in meetings even when they have brilliant ideas, who let credit for their work go to someone else without a word, who smile and nod when their boss treats them poorly, who go home every night carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. They tell themselves they're being professional, diplomatic, team players, but watch their eyes. Listen to how they talk about their lives when they think no one is paying attention. The resentment is there, simmering just beneath the surface. Every family has them too. The peacekeeper who smooths over every conflict, who makes excuses for toxic relatives, who bites their tongue when someone makes cruel jokes at their expense, who carries the emotional labor of keeping everyone comfortable while their own needs go unmet. They wear their martyrdom like a badge of honor, but the cost is their authenticity, their joy, their sense of self-worth. And in relationships, the pattern repeats. Partners who never express their true desires, who agree to things they don't want to do, who let boundaries be crossed again and again because confrontation feels worse than violation. They convince themselves they're being loving, selfless, mature. But love without honesty isn't love at all. It's performance art. Nietzsche called this the slave morality, because it's a value system created by people who felt powerless to change their circumstances, so instead they changed their definition of power. They convinced themselves that submission was actually strength, that silence was actually wisdom, that enduring abuse was actually virtue. It was a psychological coping mechanism that became so widespread it started to look like truth. But here's the thing about coping mechanisms. They're meant to be temporary. They're emergency measures to help you survive impossible situations. They're not meant to become your entire way of being in the world. When you build your identity around avoiding conflict, you're essentially announcing to the universe that you don't believe you deserve to take up space, to have opinions, to defend what matters to you. And the universe listens. It responds by sending you exactly the experiences that match your self-perception. If you act like someone who doesn't deserve respect, you'll find yourself surrounded by people who don't respect you. If you behave like someone whose opinions don't matter, you'll discover that others start treating your opinions as irrelevant. If you present yourself as someone who will absorb abuse without pushback, abusive people will find you like heat-seeking missiles. This isn't victim blaming. This is recognizing a pattern that keeps you trapped in cycles of dissatisfaction and resentment. Because when you refuse to engage in necessary conflict, you don't create peace. You create a breeding ground for exactly the kind of dynamics you're trying to avoid. But there's something even more insidious happening beneath the surface. Every time you choose silence over truth, you're not just affecting your external circumstances. You're actually rewiring your brain. You're strengthening neural pathways that associate self-advocacy with danger, that connect speaking up with threat, that link authenticity with rejection. Over time, the very idea of conflict becomes so triggering that you'll go to extraordinary lengths to avoid it, even when avoiding it costs you everything you actually want. This is how people end up living lives that feel completely foreign to them. They look in the mirror and don't recognize the person staring back. They feel disconnected from their own desires, uncertain about what they actually believe. They've spent so much energy trying to be acceptable to others that they've forgotten what it feels like to be acceptable to themselves. Nietzsche understood that this wasn't just a personal problem, it was a civilizational crisis. When entire cultures become built around the avoidance of necessary conflict, when whole societies start to prize agreement over truth, when collective harmony becomes more important than individual authenticity, something vital dies. Creativity dies, because all of these things require the willingness to challenge what exists, to question what everyone accepts, to stand up and say, this isn't working. But here's where Nietzsche's insight becomes revolutionary. He didn't just diagnose the problem. He saw the way out. He understood that buried beneath all that accumulated resentment, beneath all that learned helplessness, beneath all that fear of conflict, there was something else, something that never fully dies no matter how deeply it gets buried. He called it the will to power, but that phrase has been so misunderstood that it's almost lost its meaning. The will to power isn't about dominating others. It's about refusing to be dominated. It's not about crushing people, it's about refusing to be crushed. It's not about aggression, it's about the fundamental life force that drives everything in nature, to grow, to expand, to become what it's capable of becoming. It's the energy that makes flowers push through concrete, that drives salmon to swim upstream, that compels birds to build nests and humans to build dreams. And this force lives in you. It's been there all along, waiting beneath the layers of conditioning and fear and social programming. Every time you've felt that surge of energy when someone crosses your boundaries, that's your will to power trying to assert itself. Every time you've had a flash of anger at injustice, that's your authentic self trying to break through. Every time you've felt frustrated by your own passivity, that's your true nature calling you home. The question is, are you ready to listen? The path from recognizing your patterns to actually changing them isn't a gentle stroll through a peaceful garden. It's more like learning to breathe underwater while swimming upstream in a river of everything you've been taught to fear. But here's what Nietzsche understood that most people miss. This difficulty isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. The resistance you feel when you start to assert yourself, the guilt that floods in when you set a boundary, the anxiety that grips you when you speak an uncomfortable truth, these aren't signs that you're doing something wrong. They're signs that you're finally doing something right. Nietzsche gave us a powerful metaphor for this transformation. He described it as 3 metamorphoses of the spirit: the camel, the lion, and the child. Most people spend their entire lives as camels, carrying the burdens that others have placed on them. They pride themselves on their ability to endure, to sacrifice, to bear whatever weight is loaded onto their backs. The camel doesn't question whether the burden is fair or necessary, it just carries it, often developing a sense of identity around its capacity for suffering. If you recognize yourself in the camel, you're not alone. This is where most of us start. We learn to be good little burden bearers early in life. We internalize the message that our worth comes from our willingness to sacrifice our own needs for others. We become experts at reading rooms, anticipating what others want from us, molding ourselves to fit whatever shape seems to be required. We develop a kind of hypervigilance around conflict, scanning constantly for signs of disapproval or tension so we can adjust our behavior to restore harmony. But there comes a moment, and Nietzsche believed this moment was inevitable for anyone who wanted to truly live, when the camel can no longer bear the weight. Something inside rebels. It might be triggered by a particularly egregious injustice, a moment when someone crosses a line so blatantly that even your well-trained compliance reflex can't kick in fast enough. Or it might be more subtle, a gradual awakening to the fact that your life doesn't feel like your own anymore, that you've become a stranger to yourself in your effort to be everything to everyone else. This is when the spirit must become a lion. The lion's job is to learn to say no. Not just the polite, apologetic no that comes wrapped in justifications and escape clauses, but the deep-rooted no that comes from knowing your own worth. The lion must face what Nietzsche called the great dragon, whose scales are covered with commandments. Thou shalt be agreeable. Thou shalt not make waves. Thou shalt put others first. Thou shalt not be difficult. Fighting this dragon isn't abstract philosophy. It's showing up to that family dinner and refusing to laugh at racist jokes, even though everyone will call you too sensitive. It's telling your boss that the deadline is unrealistic, instead of working yourself into exhaustion trying to meet it. It's ending the conversation when someone speaks to you disrespectfully, instead of trying to manage their emotion. It's saying I disagree when everyone else is nodding along to something you know is wrong. Each of these moments feels like a small death, because in a way, it is. You're killing the version of yourself that gained love and acceptance through compliance. You're murdering the people-pleasing persona that kept you safe in a world that seemed to punish authenticity. You're executing the part of yourself that believed your worth depended on your usefulness to others. And this is where most people get stuck. They taste the lion's power, feel the exhilaration of standing up for themselves, experience the rush of finally speaking their truth. But then the backlash comes. People don't like it when the compliant person suddenly develops a backbone. They preferred you when you were predictable, manageable, safe. They start using words like selfish and aggressive and difficult. They withdraw their approval, their affection, their support. This is the test. This is where you discover whether your commitment to authenticity is stronger than your addiction to approval. Because make no mistake, the need for others' approval can become as powerful as any chemical dependency. The withdrawal symptoms are real: anxiety, depression, a sense of isolation that can feel overwhelming. But just like any withdrawal, the intensity passes if you can resist the urge to return to your old patterns. The lion phase isn't meant to be permanent. It's a necessary stage of development, but it's not the end goal. The lion's power comes from opposition. It knows what it's against, but it hasn't yet discovered what it's for. It's reactive rather than creative. It can tear down the old structures, but hasn't yet learned to build new ones. This is why some people get stuck in perpetual rebellion, defining themselves entirely by what they reject rather than what they embrace. The final metamorphosis is becoming the child, not the naive child who doesn't know any better, but the wise child who has integrated both the camel's capacity for commitment and the lion's power of assertion. The child creates from joy rather than from reaction. It sets boundaries not out of anger, but out of self-respect. It engages in conflict not to dominate, but to create space for truth to emerge. When you reach this stage, conflict stops being something you fear and becomes something you can navigate with skill and grace. You stop seeing every disagreement as a threat to your survival and start seeing it as an opportunity for deeper understanding. You learn to fight for what matters while letting go of what doesn't. You develop the ability to stand firm in your truth while remaining open to new information. But getting there requires what Nietzsche called becoming who you are, perhaps the most challenging and rewarding journey any human being can undertake. It means excavating yourself from under layers of other people's expectations, social conditioning, and inherited beliefs, to discover what remains when all of that is stripped away. It means learning to distinguish between your authentic desires and the desires you've been taught to have. It means developing the courage to disappoint people in service of your own integrity. This process is made infinitely more difficult by the fact that we live in a culture that profits from your compliance. There's an entire industry built around keeping you afraid of conflict, convinced that your worth comes from your agreeableness, dependent on external validation for your sense of self. The media, the education system, the workplace, even many religious institutions have a vested interest in producing people who don't question, don't challenge, don't rock the boat. But your silence comes at a cost that extends far beyond your personal life. Every time you fail to speak up against injustice, you give your implicit consent to its continuation. Every time you allow yourself to be treated poorly without consequence, you teach others that such treatment is acceptable. Every time you bite your tongue when you should speak your truth, you contribute to a culture where authenticity is rare and precious. This isn't about becoming a combative person who argues about everything. It's about developing the discernment to know when conflict is necessary and the courage to engage in it skillfully when it is. It's about learning to say hard things in ways that create connection rather than division. It's about discovering that the peace that comes from avoiding difficult conversations is a false peace, and that real peace can only emerge when truth is allowed to exist in the space between people. The journey from camel to lion to child isn't a one-time transformation. It's a spiral path that you'll travel again and again at deeper levels throughout your life. Each time you choose authenticity over approval, each time you speak truth instead of comfortable lies, each time you set a boundary instead of absorbing someone else's dysfunction, you strengthen your capacity to live as who you really are rather than who you think you should be. Nietzsche didn't promise that this path would be easy. He promised that it would be worth it, because at the end of your life, you don't want to look back and realize that you spent it performing for an audience that was never really paying attention anyway. You don't want to discover that you wasted your precious time on earth trying to be acceptable to people whose acceptance was never worth having in the first place. The question that remains is simple, but not easy. Are you ready to stop being afraid of conflict? Are you prepared to reclaim the power you've been giving away through your silence? Are you willing to risk the discomfort of other people's disapproval in exchange for the deep satisfaction of living in alignment with your truth? Because your life is waiting for you to choose it. Your authentic self is waiting